comida en las cárceles. A ver cuánto tiempo duran sus homeboys allá.
Of Joe Biden's open border policy, what our country has been plagued with.
Our brave men and women of the FBI and the local and federal state police.
What happens when the quiet streets of America's suburbs hide one of the world's most wanted men? When the calm of a Virginia morning turns into a federal storm, flashing lights, armored trucks, agents shouting commands, neighbors frozen in disbelief. That was the scene in Alexandria, Virginia, when ICE and DHS agents surrounded a narrow brick apartment complex and broke down a door that had been hiding a monster. The man inside was Ismael Enrique Mendoza Flores, known to his gang as El Calaco, the Skeleton, one of El Salvador's most ruthless killers. His trail of blood stretched from San Salvador to the U.S. East Coast. Murder, trafficking, and torture followed him like ghosts. For years, he had lived under a false identity, working as a handyman, quietly blending into the suburban calm of Northern Virginia until that morning when the illusion shattered. The arrest came after months of surveillance. Federal databases, cross-border intelligence from Interpol, and encrypted messages tracked through Operation Sentinel-Net finally closed in. ICE tactical units
security finally felt within
SUVs.
reach.
Drones monitored every escape route. When El Calaco tried to flee through a back alley, he was met by Homeland Security agents armed with ballistic shields and federal warrants. Within minutes, the skeleton fell not to bullets, but to the weight of justice he'd escaped for over a decade. But this was no isolated triumph. The operation ripped open a deeper wound. How could a man like him live undetected for years in a sanctuary city? How many others were hiding behind the same walls under false names, protected by legal loopholes and bureaucratic blind spots? As Reuters reported, the arrest reignited the debate over local cooperation with ICE. Alexandria's city council had previously limited federal access to detention records, a move that critics now called an open invitation to criminals. Supporters defended the policy as a shield for the innocent. Yet when the mugshot of El Calaco hit the airwaves, the man responsible for at least 25 murders in El Salvador, even some of those voices fell silent. By noon, federal briefings framed the capture as a model of interagency precision. DHS Secretary Tricia McLaughlin praised the agents, adding, "This administration will not allow predators to find peace in our neighborhoods." And behind her words stood President Donald Trump, who had spent months pressing states to align with federal immigration directives, a cornerstone of his 2025 border security reform. Still, as the footage replayed across major networks, armored ICE units storming the quiet Virginia street, America was left asking a darker question. How many more skeletons were out there, smiling at their neighbors, waving to school buses, waiting for the next moment of weakness in a divided nation? And deeper still, when the system built to protect begins to hide the danger, who truly holds the line between freedom and fear? The skeleton's capture should have been the end of a nightmare. Instead, it exposed a vast shadow network, one that had quietly stretched its roots from the streets of San Salvador to the neighborhoods of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. According to DHS intelligence briefings cited by BBC News and Reuters, the U.S. had become a silent haven for remnants of Mara Salvatrucha and its offshoot cells. El Calaco wasn't just hiding, he was coordinating. Messages found on his confiscated phone revealed encrypted conversations with cartel-linked contacts in Mexico and New Jersey, a mosaic of organized crime spanning 2 continents. Behind closed doors, federal analysts traced money transfers routed through shell companies registered in Delaware and Florida. The same funds financed weapons purchases, drug shipments, and human smuggling pipelines. According to Defense News, intelligence analysts called it a hybrid criminal terrorist model, one that blended gang brutality with cartel logistics, and even used AI encrypted communications, a chilling new frontier for law enforcement. In Washington, President Trump convened an emergency briefing with Secretary Noem, ordering a full-scale expansion of Operation Iron Veil, a counter-gang directive combining ICE, DEA, and FBI task forces under unified federal command. "We will not let foreign killers run American neighborhoods," he said in a televised statement that echoed through both chambers of Congress. Meanwhile, journalists descended on Alexandria. Locals described El Calaco as quiet, even polite. One neighbor told The Guardian he'd help people fix their cars. "We thought he was a mechanic, nobody knew, but federal documents painted a far darker picture. A man who had coordinated at least 4 assassinations in El Salvador while living in the US using encrypted video calls and pay-per-minute satellite phones." DW reported that European intelligence agencies, already alarmed by cartel activities spreading to southern Spain and Italy, were sharing sharing data with DHS to map the flow of illegal arms. The discovery of European-manufactured firearms in U.S. raids raised concerns that transatlantic smuggling routes were now being exploited by Central American gangs with global reach. Yet the shock went beyond intelligence circles. In Richmond, Virginia, parents protested outside the courthouse, demanding answers how many others like El Calaco had slipped through because of local sanctuary policies. State police admitted they were unaware of the fugitive's identity due to the city's refusal to share detainee data with ICE. For families who had trusted that policy as humane, the reality was unbearable. Political analysts on Al Jazeera compared the case to Europe's struggle with returning foreign fighters, a moral dilemma between openness and survival. The United States, they argued, now faced its own version of that test. Could it maintain the ideals of asylum and justice while preventing predators from exploiting compassion? The skeleton's arrest became more than a law enforcement milestone. It became a moral mirror, a story of how America's promise of refuge could be weaponized by those fleeing not persecution, but justice. As the sun set over Alexandria, a question lingered louder than the helicopters overhead. If one man could turn mercy into a mask, how many more are hiding behind the same smile, waiting for America to look away again? The echoes of El Calaco's arrest hadn't yet faded when Virginia was struck by a cascade of violent events that turned outrage into panic. 3 incidents unconnected on paper, but united by one word: failure. The first came on a gray afternoon near Richmond. Traffic cameras caught a stolen BMW swerving across I-295 at 120 miles per hour. Inside were 2 teenagers, both unvetted migrants who had entered the U.S. as minors years earlier, released under lenient policies meant to keep families together. Instead, they had joined a local offshoot of MS-13. When police closed in, the suspects opened fire bullets, slicing through commuter lanes as terrified drivers ducked for cover. Moments later, the BMW flipped and burst into flames. Reuters later confirmed that both suspects had previous arrest records but were released due to overcrowded juvenile facilities. The second shock followed days later. The Guardian reported that Rick Martinez Lopez, a convicted pedophile from Guatemala, had been rearrested after Richmond's city jail released him despite a federal immigration hold. ICE called it a direct breach of duty. The Department of Homeland Security labeled the decision barbaric. As the facts emerged, citizens gathered outside the jail holding signs that read, "Who's being protected, them or us?" Then came the case that shattered Virginia's sense of safety entirely. In Virginia Beach, an undocumented construction worker named Ricardo Leonel Mejia was hired to remodel a bathroom. Instead, he raped an 11-year-old girl 3 times. BBC cited court transcripts in which Mejia said he was just going through hard times. That phrase ignited fury. Editorials called it the death of accountability. Talk shows demanded answers from city officials. For many Virginians, compassion had crossed into betrayal. Within days, state police data revealed over 430 cases in the past 2 years involving undocumented suspects with prior deportation orders. DW noted that several were repeat offenders in jurisdictions that limited ICE cooperation. The pattern was undeniable and for many unforgivable. Social media turned the outrage viral. Families demanded action, and the hashtag #ProtectVirginia trended nationwide. Al Jazeera observed that the debate mirrored a global tension, Europe's struggle between asylum and security, now replaying across the American heartland. In a CNN town hall, one mother of 3 cried, "We were told these policies were humane, but humane for who?" Law enforcement agencies moved swiftly. Trump's Justice Department directed emergency funding to expand Operation Iron Veil, allowing ICE, FBI, and local police to share real-time arrest data through AI-assisted coordination. Defense News reported that the Pentagon even authorized technical support from its Cyber Command to intercept encrypted communications between gangs using darknet channels, an unprecedented step in domestic policing. But amid the chaos, a deeper wound was exposed: trust. Local police departments faced protests from both sides, some accusing them of inaction, others accusing them of complicity with federal overreach. America's oldest debate resurfaced in raw form: where does public safety end and human rights begin? For the families of victims, that question wasn't philosophical, it was personal. It was the echo of a child's cry, a parent's fear, a neighbor's disbelief. And as the fires on I-295 burned out, the flames of division across Virginia grew, forcing the state and soon the nation to face an impossible question: how many tragedies will it take before mercy meets its limit? The chaos on Virginia's streets soon reached the ballot box. What began as a crisis of crime had become the defining battle of the state's governor race, and a preview of America's future under President Trump's uncompromising security doctrine. Republican candidate Winsome Earl Sears, a Marine veteran and fierce Trump ally, seized the moment. Her campaign slogan, "Protect Virginia First," flashed across screens from Roanoke to Norfolk. She vowed to end every sanctuary deal, deport violent offenders, and restore federal cooperation at every level of law enforcement. In rallies covered by Reuters, her voice thundered, "This isn't complicated. You either protect your people or you don't." Across the aisle stood Abigail Spanberger, a former CIA officer and Democratic congresswoman turned gubernatorial hopeful. Once admired for her centrist approach, she now struggled to hold ground as outrage mounted. Spanberger pleaded for balance. "We can be both compassionate and safe." But The Guardian reported her words fell flat amid nightly headlines of ICE raids, shootings, and protests. BBC News described the campaign trail as a battlefield of fear and fury. Trump himself weighed in calling Virginia a test case for the soul of the nation. In his address from the White House Rose Garden, he declared, "No American should live in fear because politicians want to look compassionate." His endorsement of Sears turned the local race into a national referendum. Meanwhile, television ads blanketed the airwaves, dark cinematic clips of crime scene sirens and the faces of victims. Who protects them, the narrator asked. Polling data from DW showed a surge in voter turnout, intent among suburban mothers and retirees groups once seen as politically moderate but now galvanized by fear. On the debate stage, the contrast was visceral. Sears, sharp and direct, framed the issue as moral clarity. Spanberger, calm yet defensive, spoke of federal overreach and constitutional boundaries. "We cannot turn Virginia into a police state," she warned. But as Al Jazeera observed, the optics favored strength over nuance. In a time of chaos, fear had its own gravity. Behind the scenes, both campaigns weaponized technology. AI-driven micro-targeting ads saturated social media feeds. Leaked internal documents obtained by The Guardian revealed how algorithms identified emotional hotspots neighborhoods most affected by crime, unemployment, or immigration debates to tailor messaging. Politics had fused with data warfare, turning outrage into precision-guided persuasion. Yet amid the noise, ordinary citizens became the story's heart. One father in Fairfax told BBC, "I'm not political. I just want to know my daughter's safe." A grandmother in Chesapeake said, "I don't care about parties anymore. I care about who locks the door." Election night arrived under storm clouds and sirens. As votes rolled in, the pattern was unmistakable. Rural counties erupted in red. Urban centers clung to blue. But in the suburbs, the swing ground of the new America fear won. Sears declared victory, promising to work with President Trump to end this nightmare. Spanberger conceded, warning, "History will remember whether we chose unity or division." But beyond Virginia, analysts from Defense News noted a quieter ripple foreign capitals were watching. Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran saw United States turning inward again, prioritizing internal security over global engagement. For allies in NATO and the EU, it signaled a new chapter: America fortified at home, uncertain abroad. And as the confetti fell in Richmond, one question loomed larger than any campaign speech: when fear decides elections, who really governs the people or their fears? Within days of the election, Virginia's new leadership received a directive stamped with the presidential seal, Homeland Enforcement Directive 27A. Signed personally by President Donald Trump and Secretary Kristi Noem, it authorized aggressive coordination between federal and state agencies to identify, detain, and deport high-risk non-citizens. It was the beginning of what Reuters called the most sweeping domestic security mobilization since 2001. ICE expanded overnight. DHS deployed new AI-driven reconnaissance systems under Operation Iron Veil, integrating biometric scanners, real-time license plate tracking, and AI behavioral mapping. The stated goal: dismantle transnational networks before they could strike again. At a press briefing covered by BBC News Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin delivered the administration's message in one thunderous line: President Trump and Secretary Noem will not let gang members terrorize American citizens. Standing behind her tactical teams in new DHS combat gear symbolized a new era, one where law enforcement looked increasingly like military command. But this wasn't just about Virginia. As DW reported, 10 states had already pledged full compliance with the new directive. Governors from Texas, Florida, and Arizona echoed Trump's words, "Sanctuary is over." In contrast, governors from California, Illinois, and New York vowed to resist framing it as an assault on states' rights. The result was a nation split by enforcement lines, a patchwork America where safety depended on your zip code. Inside DHS headquarters, internal memos leaked to The Guardian revealed deep divisions. Veteran agents warned of mission creep, the growing overlap between law enforcement and national defense. One senior ICE officer wrote anonymously, "We're not soldiers, but Washington is asking us to act like it." Still, morale among frontline units soared as funding surged and political backing became ironclad. Meanwhile, Defense News disclosed that the Pentagon had quietly authorized limited logistical support for DHS, including aerial surveillance and encrypted communications networks once reserved for overseas counter-terror operations. The shift blurred boundaries between domestic policing and national defense, a trend that alarmed civil liberties watchdogs across Europe and the United States. Trump, addressing the United Nations in New York, dismissed criticism. America will protect its people first. He declared his tone defiant, his message unmistakable. No foreign killer will hide behind our laws again. Al Jazeera reported that UN delegates from Latin America walked out in protest. But at home, approval ratings surged past 60%, driven by voters who believed the crackdown restored control. As new raids unfolded from Miami to Minneapolis, BBC journalists embedded with ICE teams captured the tense rhythm of midnight operations, armored vehicles rolling through silent streets, floodlights cutting through darkness, shouts of federal agents echoing across cul-de-sacs. The footage drew both praise and fear, a portrait of a nation at war with its own shadows. Yet, even supporters admitted the campaign carried risks. Economists warned that mass deportations could strain agriculture, construction, and service industries. The Wall Street Journal noted rising labor shortages. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International, cautioned against the normalization of emergency power. Still, for many Americans, the numbers told the story. Violent crime linked to known gang affiliates dropped 18% within 3 months in Virginia and Florida. Drug seizures tripled along the I-95 corridor. Trump declared the results proof that strength works. But as agents kicked down another door in another quiet suburb, a question grew louder: if a nation must turn its streets into battlegrounds to feel safe, how long before freedom becomes collateral damage? By spring 2025, the storm that began in Virginia had swept across the nation. Sanctuary policies were collapsing under federal pressure, ICE field offices were operating at full capacity, and the term domestic stability had become the administration's rallying cry. Yet behind the facade of restored order, America stood at a crossroads, torn between its promise of freedom and its hunger for control. In Washington, President Donald Trump addressed Congress in a televised State of the Union that drew over 150 million viewers. His words were measured but unmistakable. The days of lawless borders and lawless cities are over. The American people deserve protection, not excuses. The chamber erupted in applause from Republicans and silence from Democrats. Reuters noted that it was the most polarizing speech of his presidency, one that solidified the new national identity: security first, compassion second. In Europe, DW reported that NATO analysts were watching closely. The United States' internal shift had strategic consequences: fewer resources for global deployments, more emphasis on homeland defense. Allies in Poland and the Baltic states worried that U.S. retrenchment could embolden Russia. Defense News added that intelligence sharing with European partners was being recalibrated, prioritizing border surveillance over traditional overseas operations. America's focus had turned inward, its strength refocused, but its reach diminished. Inside the country, the divide deepened. The Guardian described towns split down the middle, families with mixed immigration status living in constant fear, while others celebrated what they called the return of law. In Los Angeles, protests filled the streets, waving banners reading "No nation without justice." In Texas, counter rallies responded with "No justice without order." Meanwhile, BBC News documented human stories that policy could not explain. Children separated from detained parents, small businesses collapsing without workers, church groups smuggling food to those afraid to leave their homes. Compassion had not vanished, it had gone underground. Still, supporters of Trump's enforcement campaign pointed to statistics: record low border crossings, plummeting gang-related homicides, and a new sense of deterrence across Central America. On Al Jazeera, a Salvadoran official admitted, "For the first time, our fugitives fear the United States again." For the White House, that statement was a victory not of politics, but of principle. Yet as Virginia's skyline glowed over calm neighborhoods once haunted by violence, a quieter tension lingered. Some wondered whether America had defeated its enemies or merely redefined them. Others questioned whether freedom, when guarded by fear, could still call itself freedom at all. And in the final frame of this unfolding American story, the question returns the same one whispered on that morning in Alexandria when agents dragged El Calaco from his hiding place. When safety becomes the nation's greatest weapon who protects the soul of the Republic. The story of Virginia's descent into crisis begins with the capture of Ismael El Calaco Mendoza Flores, one of El Salvador's most wanted men. His arrest reveals a web of transnational crime infiltrating American neighborhoods, igniting outrage after a series of violent incidents exposes the failure of local sanctuary policies. As fear spreads, Virginia's governor race becomes a national flashpoint, with Trump-backed Winsome Sears calling for zero tolerance and defeating Democrat Abigail Spanberger in a landslide. In response, President Donald Trump and Secretary Kristi Noem launch Homeland Enforcement Directive 27A, deploying AI surveillance and nationwide ICE coordination under Operation Iron Veil. The result is historic crime drops, deportations surge, but so do divisions. Across America, protests rise, industries falter, and allies abroad question a U.S. turning inward. What began as a manhunt in Virginia evolves into a defining test of America's identity, a clash between mercy and protection, liberty and control. And as the nation tightens its grip, one question remains in securing the homeland: has America safeguarded its future or surrendered part of its soul?